listener production.
Hey, it's Helen Smith here with you. Welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, Senator David Pocock joins me to explain what's going on with our universities here in Australia, as our trust in unis continues to dwindle over funding, job cuts and failures to report gender-based violence on campuses, with many losing sight of what their purpose is and acting as businesses first rather than educational institutions. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines. It's Thursday, the 25th of September. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has given his first speech to the UN General Assembly, putting a spotlight on climate change just a day after US President Donald Trump called it a con job.
Clean energy can carry the world beyond the false choice between economic growth and environmental responsibility.
The PM also addressed Australia's intention of securing a temporary seat on the UN Security Council in 2029, a move first pushed by the previous coalition government.
The United Nations is much more than an arena for the great powers to veto each other's ambitions. This is a platform for middle powers and small nations to voice and achieve our aspirations.
When it came to the war on Gaza, Albanese told world leaders to seize the moment of opportunity and work towards peace in the Middle East, saying Hamas must have no role in Gaza's future, but he did not mention Israel by name, following the official recognition of Palestinian statehood made by Australia and other Western nations in recent days. The 19-minute speech was Albanese's first at the UN headquarters, as previously Foreign Minister Penny Wong has taken the stage. A Bali hospital has denied allegations that it was involved in organ theft after the body of a young Australian who died in Indonesia was repatriated without his heart. Queensland man Byron Haddo was found earlier this year in the plunge pool of his Bali villa while holidaying. However, when the 23-year-old was returned to Australia 4 weeks later, a second autopsy found his heart was missing, prompting Australian officials to demand answers from their Indonesian counterpart and the hospital involved in the initial forensic autopsy, which was carried out after a request from local police. And it looks like Snoop Dogg is still set to perform at the AFL Grand Final this Saturday, despite pushback and controversy over his selection because of past misogynistic and homophobic lyrics, which comes as the AFL works to tackle homophobia within the league. The musician arrived in Melbourne earlier this week, having a kick-off at the MCG with Collingwood stars Nick and Josh Dacos, telling media he understood it's not just a sport, it's a way of life.
I know it's not just a team or a club, it's part of your DNA. So I understand what is at stake.
However, the AFL declined to put Snoop up for an all-in media conference like they have for previous entertainers, including Katy Perry and Robbie Williams. Now it's time to get into our deep dive with Senator David Pocock on what needs to change when it comes to current governance arrangements with our universities and how institutions are tackling issues like sexual assault and harassment on campus. Senator Pocock, what's the state of our trust in universities across Australia right now?
It's in serious trouble. We've seen across the country, I think, real issues and failures of governance and at times leadership that has really, brought into question current governance arrangements and some of these extraordinary salaries that vice chancellors are getting. You'd have to say that they're probably not living up to what you'd expect for someone who's being paid so much to do that job.
When we're talking about some of those insane salaries and HECS debt as well, when students are struggling quite heavily with that, how does that look on universities?
It's not a good look. And I think there's both clearly an issue with governance and some of the things that are happening at universities, but I think there's a broader, bigger question around funding of universities. And I think as a country, we've kind of lost sight of what universities are for. And we've seen over the last couple of decades a decline in things like research funding to universities. We've seen job-ready graduates, which is a totally failed program when it comes to how universities are paid for different courses. And I think in the lack of funding, universities have gone out and essentially had to become businesses and have generated income from international students to cross-subsidise research, to cross-subsidise building of facilities. In the instance of, say, University of Western Sydney, they're actually using international student money to cross-subsidise things like food pantries for domestic students who can't afford to buy food. And so I think there's a whole range of issues, and certainly something I've been trying to get the government to turn their mind to. Sure, a 20% cut on HECS debts is very welcome if you've got a HECS debt, but it doesn't actually deal with the root cause of a system where we're seeing bad governance, all sorts of issues arising, and students ending up with, $50,000 plus HECS debts at the end of the day.
And we'll get into some of those issues that they're facing in a moment. But sticking with funding, how important are universities for Australia's economy, especially when it comes to international enrolments?
International students, I think, are now our fourth biggest export. So they're a sizable chunk of revenue generation and clearly very important for universities, given we've seen a decline in things like research funding. And so, I think this is a really tricky thing to deal with. We saw the government in the last term under pressure around net overseas migration and concerns about housing, really try and, I think, scapegoat international students in a way that was really unhelpful. And if you look at what that's done to university and some of the uncertainty around it, it hasn't been good. And so I think we need to get better at actually having these bigger conversations where you're actually looking at things at a systems level and saying, okay, well, universities need funding to be able to do things like research and world-class education. But we really should be turning our mind to issues around governance. And, a lot of my focus has been on the Australian National University because clearly it's had huge governance failures. It's had, I think, a failure of leadership and communication to the point where we've seen the Vice-Chancellor resign to the applause of staff at a town hall. And the ANU is the only university that's actually an act of parliament and answers directly to the minister and to the parliament. And my argument has been, well, we have the ANU Act that sets out governance arrangement. Let's make sure this is actually fit for purpose and is setting the standard in 2025 when it comes to governance so that states and territories and other universities can start to work towards that.
Yeah, funding has been a contentious issue for ANU, who last year announced plans to save over $250 million in operating costs by 2026, which is looming. It's only, in a couple of months. How do they plan to do this?
They've divided the $250 million cuts between staffing and then, non-staffing sort of operating costs. One of the things that I think was really the undoing of the Vice-Chancellor was the lack of transparency around the need to make those changes. There were a number of big consultancy contracts given, consultants brought in, and these sort of change management plans that went out. And I think many people at the university felt like it was a real sham consultation on these change management plans, and there was some sort of ideology behind what was being done rather than fronting up to the community and saying, listen, we do have issues. This is exactly what it looks like. There was very little transparency around the finances. Let's find a way forward. It was very much this kind of corporate approach where you get consultants in, they come up with a plan, then you just execute that plan. And I don't think that is the way to be dealing with public institutions. And in the case of the ANU, they're paying consultants millions to provide advice on governance, when you have genuine experts in that field at places like the Crawford School and others, who I think would have been very happy to be involved in a process to deal with things at the ANU.
Earlier this month at UTS, they also announced that they'll be closing some of its schools, international studies, education, and public health under a multi-million-dollar restructure. What does closing courses like this mean for Australia and future students?
It's really worrying to see the kinds of courses that universities are choosing to no longer offer. In the UTS example, something like teaching, we have a teacher shortage in many places across the country, and yet we have universities saying they're no longer going to offer that. Here at the ANU, we've seen some of the most popular courses being cut. It makes absolutely no sense when you're looking at, well, what are universities for? What is their role? The only way it makes sense is that you have consultants who are brought in to essentially just say, well, don't worry about your purpose and the role you're meant to be playing in society. We're just looking at how can you cut costs, be more profitable, or I guess make less of a loss. So I think this does need to feed into the big conversation around what are universities for, what role do we want them playing in our societies, and how do we fund that, ensure that they are financially sustainable. But yeah, they really, I think in many instances, it points to kind of this disconnect between the chancellery, the people making these decisions, and I think staff and students and the wider Australian public who kind of look at it and go, this is nuts.
This year and over the past couple of years, we have also seen a big national spotlight on sexual harm and gender-based violence across campuses. UTS is currently under investigation by the National Student Ombudsman over failing to improve their reporting on these issues. We've seen some big promises and reviews happening across universities, but what is actually being done to address issues like gender-based violence on campus?
There's a huge amount of work to do in this space. I think the fact that we now have a student ombudsman, I think points to what can happen when you have pressure from groups like the Stop Campaign, Fair Agenda, End Rape on Campus. They did a huge amount of work to really shine a light on these issues that are happening on campuses across the country. Then you had the crossbench working with the government in the last term to set up the student ombudsman, and want to sort of thank Minister Clare for his work on this. Now it's time to actually get to work and ensure that this is being dealt with, that there are consequences, that unis have programs in place and processes to not only deal with allegations when they happen, but also to create better cultures on campus where we're not having to deal with this sort of thing. Yes, this is a broader societal issue that we're dealing with, but I think we do see some pretty egregious examples on university campuses.
Why do you think it's taken this long for it to be taken so seriously?
It's obviously a complex issue at a societal level, family and domestic violence, violence against women. This is something that people are concerned about, but there's no one way to stop this. We need broad societal change, and we also need institutions stepping up. And I think some of the ways that universities have tried to sidestep their obligations haven't been good enough. And I think credit to some of the work done in the last parliament, there's more of a willingness from politicians now to actually say, this is the expectation and you have to step up and meet this. As inconvenient as it may be in terms of bad press or anything else, you've got to find a way to deal with it. Looking
ahead, what do you think are the biggest changes that need to happen in our universities across Australia, especially when it comes to governance and leadership?
I've been working with a group of academics at the ANU to really look at this question. What does good governance look like? And they have both looked across the world at top universities, what are their governance structures, as well as done really detailed surveys and kitchen table conversations with hundreds of people at the Australian National University. They've put together a bit of a proposal about what that could look like. So I would say we need to be listening to experts like that when it comes to governance. But again, I really want to bang on about the point that this needs to be part of a broader focus on funding and sustainability of Australian universities. We have to change job-ready graduates. It is a broken program that has failed. That needs to be overhauled urgently. And we also need to be funding research more in this country, both in terms of quantum, but also some longer grants for researchers. So they're not spending 50% of their time filling out forms when they could be actually working on solving some of the big problems we're facing.
Senator Pocock, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you, Helen.
That was Senator David Pocock there. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Insta at The Briefing Podcast. And we'll be back in your feed with another briefing this evening on the AFL versus homophobia. I'm Helen Smith. Catch you next time.